You are trying to control something right now. Your reputation, someone's opinion of you, the outcome of a situation you can't fully see. And deep in the background of your mind, that need for control is quietly destroying you. Here's what nobody tells you about the pursuit of peace. It doesn't come from winning. It doesn't come from being liked. It doesn't come from removing all uncertainty from your life. Peace, or our unshakable sovereign peace, comes from understanding one ancient truth that the greatest minds in history discovered, lived by, and died defending. This is Stoic motivation. And what you're about to learn may permanently rewrite the way you see yourself, your problems, and your power. 2,000 years ago, a slave sat in chains and wrote some of the most powerful words ever committed to parchment. His name was Epictetus. He had no property, no freedom of movement. His master once twisted his leg so hard it broke, and Epictetus, without flinching, simply said, "I told you it would break." That is not weakness. That is not resignation. That is the terrifying, weaponized power of a mind that has learned the fundamental law of human existence, the law that separates people who suffer endlessly from people who rise repeatedly, no matter what life throws at them. Today, we are going to go deep into that law. We are going to look it straight in the eye and understand it, not just intellectually, but viscerally, in a way that changes how you move through the world. This is the truth about control and peace. And by the end of this video, you will have something most people search for their entire lives: Stoic motivation that is not built on hype or hollow affirmations, but on bedrock principles that have survived empires, wars, and centuries. Stay with me. This changes everything. Let's start with the foundation. The very first line of Epictetus's Enchiridion, the handbook he never actually wrote, but that his students compiled from his teachings, begins with this: "Some things are in our control, and others are not." 8 words, devastating in their simplicity, world-altering in their implications. Because here's the truth about the human condition. We spend approximately 90% of our mental and emotional energy on things we cannot control. Economy, other people's behavior, whether we get the job, the deal, the relationship, the recognition. We negotiate with outcomes, we bargain with fate. We lose sleep over variables we cannot move by a single degree. And we call this caring, we call this being invested, we call this trying hard. But Stoic motivation teaches us something that most modern self-help books are too afraid to say. Caring about outcomes you cannot control is not ambition. It is suffering you have voluntarily chosen. But here's what most people never realize. The dichotomy of control isn't about passivity. It is not about sitting back and letting the world happen to you. The Stoics were generals, emperors, gladiators, and warriors. Marcus Aurelius ran the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen while writing the most psychologically sophisticated journal in history. They acted relentlessly, strategically, ferociously, but they acted only on what they could influence: their judgments, their choices, their character, their effort, their attention, and everything outside of that, held loosely. Not because they didn't care, but because they understood that the mind which clenches too tightly around outcomes it cannot guarantee eventually breaks under the pressure it created for itself. This next principle is where it gets surgical. Stay with me. Imagine your mind is a fortress. Most people build their fortress on external ground. They make their peace dependent on their partner staying, the market going up, their boss approving, their audience applauding. And every time the external world shifts, which it always does, their fortress crumbles and they rebuild it and it crumbles again. This is not a strategy. This is psychological architecture designed for suffering. The Stoics built differently. They built their peace entirely inside the walls of their own judgment. And that is the architecture of genuine Stoic motivation, not dependent on circumstances, not hostage to results, not fragile to the opinions of people who will forget your name in a generation. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But let's go deeper than the quote and understand the psychological mechanics behind it. When you are disturbed, truly shaken by something, it is never the event itself doing the disturbing. It is your judgment about the event, your interpretation, the story your mind constructs in the aftermath of what happened. The Stoics called this the ruling faculty, the hegemonikon, and they argued with ruthless precision that this faculty was the only thing in the universe that was entirely yours. This is where everything changes. Because if your peace is a product of your judgment and your judgment is within your control, then peace is never actually taken from you. It is only abandoned. Every time you lose your peace, you chose, consciously or unconsciously, to give authority over your inner world to something outside it. That is not fate. That is not the world being cruel. That is a decision. And what is a decision can be unmade. Keep watching. The next section explains why most people fail to apply this and how you can succeed where they don't. Epictetus said something that will rearrange your interior landscape if you let it land properly. He said, "Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things." But let's translate that into the language of your actual life. You did not get the promotion. That's an event. Neutral, a fact, but your mind wraps it in a story. I am not good enough. The system is rigged. Nothing I do matters. And that story is not the event. That story is your judgment. And your judgment is where your suffering lives. The Stoics identified two primary chains that keep human beings in psychological bondage: desire and aversion. We desire what we don't have, and we are averse to what we might lose. And here is the razor-sharp insight that Stoic motivation cuts into you. Both of those chains are pointed outward, both of them wrapped around things you cannot fully guarantee. But here's what most people never realize. The goal is not to destroy desire. The goal is to redirect it. Redirect desire toward virtue, toward being the best version of yourself in this moment. Redirect it toward effort rather than outcome, and redirect it toward your own growth rather than other people's validation. And redirect aversion inward. Be averse to cowardice, to dishonesty, to the betrayal of your own values. Those are the only things truly worth fearing. When your desires and your fears are aimed at things you can control, you become psychologically invincible. Not because you never fail, but because failure no longer touches the part of you that matters, the core that defines who you are. It no longer has the power to shake your identity or destabilize your peace. Stay with me. We're going deeper now. Friedrich Nietzsche, not a Stoic, but a philosopher deeply shaped by Stoic thought, coined a phrase that contains what might be the single most psychologically transformative idea ever expressed: amor fati, the love of fate. Not mere acceptance of fate, not passive resignation, not silent tolerance of what happens, but an active, almost defiant love of everything that unfolds in your life. The Stoics had their own interpretation of this idea. Marcus Aurelius described it as willing what happens, while Epictetus framed it as aligning yourself with nature, living in harmony with reality instead of resisting it at every turn. And this is where Stoic motivation becomes something far deeper than surface-level inspiration, something most people are not prepared to fully absorb. The obstacle is not in your way. The obstacle is the way. Here's what most high achievers misunderstand. They interpret difficulty as a detour, as proof that something has gone wrong, as a signal that they chose incorrectly or that the world is working against them. They treat resistance as a problem rather than part of the process. But the Stoic perspective reframes this completely. Every hardship becomes raw material. Every failure becomes data. Every loss becomes a forge, a place where you are tested, refined, and strengthened, if you choose to engage with it instead of resisting it. Marcus Aurelius himself endured immense hardship. He lost children, faced devastating plagues, dealt with betrayal within his own ranks, and spent years leading campaigns in brutal, freezing conditions. Yet his writings are not filled with complaints, but with reflections on how to respond with discipline, clarity, and virtue. That is not abstract philosophy or motivational rhetoric. That is a daily, deliberate practice of transforming fate into fuel. If you truly want peace, you must stop fighting what has already happened. The battle against the past is unwinnable. The only question that remains is what you will construct from what is left behind. This next section is where everything becomes practical. Philosophy without action is decoration. It looks impressive, but it changes nothing. So now we get precise. We break this down into what Stoic motivation actually looks like in real life. Not in theory, not in quotes, but in the moments when things don't go your way. When your plans fall apart, when reality refuses to cooperate. The Stoics developed three core disciplines, not abstract ideas, but practical systems for living, and these remain just as powerful today as they were centuries ago when Marcus Aurelius practiced them in the quiet, cold hours before dawn in a military camp. The first is the discipline of desire. Each morning, before you step into the world and allow it to pull at your attention, pause and ask yourself a simple but confronting question. What am I wanting today that I cannot control? What outcomes am I attaching my peace to? And then consciously shift that desire, redirect it. Instead of wanting results, want effort. Instead of wanting validation, want integrity. Instead of wanting things to go your way, want to show up in a way that you respect. These are desires that cannot be taken from you. They exist entirely within your control, and they redefine success on terms that are unshakable. The second is the discipline of action. Act fully, but without attachment. This does not mean hesitation or weakness. It means executing with complete commitment while refusing to tie your identity to the result. You give everything you have to the process, knowing that the outcome is influenced by factors beyond your control. And then you let go. This is not passive, it is strategic. It is understanding that gripping outcomes too tightly creates tension, anxiety, and distortion in your actions, while releasing them allows clarity, precision, and consistency. It is the highest form of disciplined execution. The third is the discipline of assent. This is where control becomes immediate and moment to moment. Throughout the day, your mind generates reactions automatically. Something happens, and instantly it is labeled as bad, unfair, catastrophic. But the Stoics trained themselves to pause before agreeing with those initial impressions. When something triggers you, step back and question it. Is this truly harmful or just uncomfortable? Is this damaging my character or simply challenging my preferences? Is this reality or just a conditioned response built from years of unexamined reactions? This pause, this gap between stimulus and judgment, is where your power lives. And the more you practice it, the more control you reclaim over your internal world. These three disciplines practiced daily construct something extraordinary, a self that cannot be conquered by circumstance, a mind that does not fracture under pressure, a way of being that remains stable even when everything external becomes unstable. This is not theory, this is the systematic construction of inner strength. One more section, and it's the one that ties everything together. Here's something modern culture has completely misunderstood. We have been conditioned to believe that more noise, more hustle, more stimulation, more reaction, more output is the signature of someone serious, someone important, someone powerful. But history tells a very different story. The most dangerous, impactful individuals, the ones who shaped civilizations, led empires, and influenced the course of humanity, were not defined by chaos or constant motion, but by an internal stillness so deep it unsettled those around them. Marcus Aurelius ruled over tens of millions of people, yet in his private writings he reflected on the insignificance of ego, the fleeting nature of fame, and the central importance of virtue above all else. Seneca, despite immense wealth and influence, wrote extensively about the emptiness of a life lived without reflection and values. Cato faced death with a level of calm that felt almost inhuman. This is what Stoic motivation reveals at its deepest level. Peace is not the absence of difficulty, noise, or conflict. Peace is the presence of sovereignty, the ability to remain internally anchored regardless of external turbulence. But here's a truth that modern motivation culture rarely acknowledges because it cannot profit from it. Peace is disruptive. A person who is genuinely at peace, who does not crave constant validation, who is not driven by comparison, who does not depend on external approval, becomes almost impossible to manipulate. Entire systems are built on keeping you slightly dissatisfied, slightly restless, slightly uncertain about yourself. Your anxiety fuels industries. Your insecurity drives consumption. Your constant search for more keeps entire markets alive. The Stoics recognized this dynamic long before modern economies existed. They described it as living according to opinion, structuring your life around what others think, what society rewards, what the crowd values, and they warned that this is the fastest path to a wasted life. To cultivate stillness in a world that profits from your agitation is not passive. It is one of the most radical, powerful acts you can take. That stillness is not weakness. It is control at the highest level. And once you build it, you must protect it with intention, because it is one of the most valuable assets you will ever possess. Stay for the final section. The culmination is here. We began with a man in chains, a man who owned nothing, who had no power in the conventional sense, who could be harmed, controlled, and limited at the whim of others. And yet Epictetus was free in the only way that truly matters, because real freedom has never been about external circumstances. It has always been about the relationship between your mind and the reality it experiences. You can live in luxury and still be trapped by fear, anxiety, and dependence on others' opinions. You can have nothing and still possess complete internal authority. History has shown this repeatedly, and the Stoics embodied it fully. Now here is the final truth, the one everything leads to. Control, as most people pursue it, is an illusion. The constant need to control outcomes, to guarantee results, to force reality into a specific shape. It does not create peace. It creates tension. It creates anxiety. It creates a quiet, invisible prison where your well-being is always dependent on something outside your reach. But the Stoic path reveals something radically different. When you release your grip on what you cannot control, you do not lose power. You reclaim it. When you redirect your focus entirely toward what is actually within your influence, your character, your decisions, your reactions, your effort, your principles, something fundamental shifts. You stop reacting to life and you start shaping your response to it. You are no longer pulled in every direction by external forces. You become centered, intentional, deliberate. You stop being a passenger in your own life. You stop being controlled by circumstances, by other people's moods, by outcomes you cannot guarantee. You become the source of your actions, the cause of your direction, the architect of your internal world. Not because life becomes easier, not because obstacles disappear, but because you have accessed something that cannot be taken from you. The authority of a disciplined, self-governed mind. That is what real peace is. Not fragile temporary comfort, but a hardened, unshakable stability built through understanding, practice, and choice. It is the kind of peace that does not disappear when life becomes difficult, but instead becomes stronger because of it. It is the peace of someone who has been tested and has chosen, again and again, to respond with clarity, discipline, and virtue instead of reaction. So here is where we land. You came into this video perhaps looking for motivation, something to push you through the day, something to make the struggle feel lighter, something that would give you a temporary surge of energy to keep going. But what you've encountered is something far sharper, far more enduring, not just motivation, but a framework for how to exist, a code to operate by, a set of principles that have survived the rise and fall of empires and have been tested under conditions far more extreme than anything most people will ever face. Stoic motivation is not about feeling good in the moment. It is about becoming someone who is no longer easily shaken. It is about building a version of yourself that is internally stable, someone whose peace is not tied to outcomes, whose sense of power does not depend on approval, and whose identity is not constructed from the reflections of other people's opinions. The Stoics did not just talk about these ideas, they lived them, embodied them, and in many cases, suffered and died holding on to them. And in doing so, they left behind something invaluable for every generation that followed. The understanding that peace is not something handed to you by the world, not something that arrives when circumstances finally align, not something reserved for a perfect future. Peace is something you claim, here, now, in this exact moment, with the exact life you have. So take what you've learned and apply it. Practice the discipline of desire. Shift your focus away from what you cannot control and toward what you can embody. Act with full commitment, but without attachment to outcomes. Monitor your ascent. Question your reactions before accepting them as truth. Learn to love your fate, not just tolerate it. And most importantly, build your inner foundation so strong that it cannot be shaken by anything external. Build your fortress within where no circumstance, no opinion, no loss can reach you. And remember this above everything else, the obstacle is always the way. The difficulty you are facing is not separate from your path. It is the path. It is the mechanism through which you are shaped, refined, and strengthened. If this video reached something in you, if it shifted your perspective even slightly, then carry that forward, because becoming the person you are capable of being is not something that happens in a single moment of insight. It is built deliberately, Consistently, day by day, choice by choice, stay committed to that process. And take a moment to reflect. What is the one thing you are trying to control right now that is outside your control? Name it, acknowledge it, and make the decision to release it. There is power in that act alone. I will see you in the next one.